Most people in Europe felt like the war would be a very quick affair. Oh, how they were wrong. World War I was fought from 1914 until 1918 and caused massive devastation across Europe. There were two fronts to the war. A front is basically where the war is being fought. There was the Western Front in Western Europe and an Eastern Front near Russia. This put Austria and Germany at a disadvantage because they had to fight a two-front war. This means they were surrounded on both sides. Not cool. Although even more not cool for Russia because they were technically fighting a three-front war. Okay, they were fighting with the Allies on the Western Front. They were also fighting on the Eastern Front and with the Ottoman Empire. So technically, they were fighting the war in three places. All right. So Austria and Germany, although they were surrounded, they're going to kick some major booty early on, to a large extent because of their war machine. They had a lot of soldiers, as well as some really amazing technology. You know, much of the war along the Western Front was fought using trench warfare. Soldiers would dig lines of trenches on each side and would fall back to other trenches if the enemy managed to penetrate their line. Trench warfare was miserable and resulted in a stalemate between the Allies and the Central Powers. A stalemate means that nothing's happening on either side. Well, a lot is happening, but no one's gaining any ground. Once in a while, generals would order their men to rush the enemy by entering the space in between the trenches called no man's land. This was pretty pointless and resulted in low morale and many deaths, without progress on either side. So really, that is what a stalemate is, essentially. It's when neither side gains any ground. So each side just shelled the heck out of each other, killing millions, but never resulting in any real progress. Can you imagine the frustration? World War I saw the use of many new war technologies. All of that from the Industrial Revolution, including Zeppelins for reconnaissance. These are basically blimps used to spy on the enemy. That's what reconnaissance means. Hey, look at the Led Zeppelin 4 album cover. You'll see a burned out Zeppelin called the Hindenburg. A very unfortunate accident involving flammable hydrogen gas. But I digress. Anyway, it's also a cool album, so check it out. Other new weapons from World War I included machine guns, airplanes, resulting in dogfights in the sky. Go look up the Red Baron on Google. Flamethrowers, grenades, grenade launchers and crossbows, tanks, and artillery. If you're a military history buff, this war's for you. Artillery basically refers to giant cannons that can launch Honda Civic-sized bombs all the way from Brighton High School out to Eastview Mall. Yeah, they could shoot a 2,000-pound bomb or shell about 9 miles. So that's pretty far. The Germans had a really famous artillery cannon that was called Big Bertha. The Germans also used submarine warfare. Subs, called U-boats by the Germans, were really deadly during World War I because sonar technology did not yet exist, not until World War II. So it was really difficult to combat this technology. The Allies tried to use ship blockades to starve the Germans and prevent supplies from being delivered, which was actually highly effective. I don't know if you're aware of this, but more people died because of this blockade than died from German submarine warfare. But we tend to focus on German U-boats, but hey. Perhaps the most deadly of weapons during World War One, poison gas, including mustard and chlorine gas. Following World War One, countries of the world agreed to not use these in warfare anymore. We'll talk more about why that is later. New technology made the war stalemate even worse, and pretty soon it seemed like the Germans and Austrians would win. First of all, Russia took off from the war. Remember our cafeteria food fight simulation when Russia went to a counseling appointment and left our food fight? Right. Well, we'll learn next unit that in 1917, Russia had a revolution in which a group of socialists called the Bolsheviks, who wanted to start a new government that embraced the ideas of Karl Marx, captured the Tsar and his family, and eventually executed them. So, with their own civil war taking place, the Russians could no longer fight in World War I. They'd already lost more men than any other nation. So their new leader, a guy named Lenin, he's going to go sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Central Powers, and he'll withdraw from the war. The Allies were like, wait a minute, this stinks. Now Germany and Austria can concentrate on the war along the Western Front. Oh, snap! And it really looked as though the Central Powers would win. That is, until the U.S. joined up, providing fresh soldiers. It was all about manpower at this point. We'd already been supplying weapons to the Europeans for years, and it was highly profitable for the Americans to sell weapons to the Allies. This had angered the Central Powers. In fact, they were looking for ways to stop us from delivering weapons to the Allies for years, and were keen to, make sure that we stayed out of the war. There were really two primary reasons that we finally agreed to wage war on the Central Powers. First, the Germans supposedly torpedoed a passenger ship called the Lusitania. Remember Lucy and our food fight? This was a British ship with American weapons on board. Actually, a pretty nice ship. It was the sister ship to the Titanic, and, that's not bad luck or anything. Anyway, there were several hundred Americans on board, so many Americans died when it was torpedoed and sank. Although, there is reason to believe today that it was an explosion on board that sank the ship and not a German sub. But of course, the Germans were blamed, and propaganda posters showing American women and children drowning had many Americans calling for blood. But we still didn't join up. But then, dum-dum-dum, supposedly a message from the Germans that was en route to Mexico, called the Zimmerman Note, which asked the Mexicans to attack the USA in exchange for money, guns, and support, was intercepted by the British and handed over to the U.S. So of course this was the reason we were looking for to go to war. The Americans actually proved to be the difference during this time, and pretty soon the Central Powers were forced to surrender to the Allies. World War I ended on what was later known as Armistice Day, on the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour. We actually call this Veterans Day now in the States, but Western Europeans still commemorate their veterans on Armistice Day. Well, it ended with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Remember Versailles, the palace? There you go. However, this was not the war to end all wars, as people had thought. Oh no, it led to many more conflicts. Georges Clemenceau of France, who was Prime Minister Lloyd George from Great Britain, and President Wilson from the USA, they were called the Big Three, they helped to write the Treaty of Versailles. However, each of the Allied countries had very different ideas about what should happen in Europe following the war. Under the Treaty of Versailles, there were territorial losses. Land was taken from Germany, and many new countries formed in Europe from what had been the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Remember the bomb effect of nationalism? Yeah, the Austro-Hungarian Empire fell apart after the war, and the map of Europe forever changed. Germany was expected to take responsibility for the war, even though it really wasn't all their fault, although they were certainly very aggressive. There were military restrictions placed on Germany following World War I, such as their army and navy were limited in size. Another result of World War I? War guilt. Write that down. Germany was also forced to pay war reparations, or large sums of money, to help undo war damage to the other European nations, especially they had to give this money to France and Great Britain. And this made many Germans super upset. Many Germans felt that the war wasn't entirely their fault, yet they felt like they were expected to shoulder the entire blame. Remember Willie in our food fight who was called out by the security team to go and clean up the cafeteria and get in trouble? Right. You know, other countries were also unhappy in addition to Germany after World War I. Like Italy, who had switched sides, they didn't get some of the land that they were promised. Another country that was unhappy? Japan. They had land claims in China that weren't recognized by the Allies. The Chinese were also unhappy because the Japanese had been actually given some land in China, or were allowed to keep some of that territory. And then the Russians were unhappy because many independent nations like Latvia, Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, they'd all become nations following World War I, where once they'd been part of the massive Russian Empire. So, you know, it looks like the Russian Empire fell apart after World War I as well. Another effect of nationalism, the bomb effect. You know, those nations were granted self-determination, and the Russian Empire fell apart. World War I also ended with the formation of a peace organization called the League of Nations. This was a group or club of over 40 countries that hoped to solve problems in the world by negotiations or diplomacy. The League of Nations was formed to make sure there would never again be another global war or conflict. Yeah, how'd that work out? You know, the League of Nations was actually part of Woodrow Wilson's 14-point peace plan for Europe, which was largely ignored by the Allies, who were grateful for the U.S.'s help, but, you know, they didn't want to see the USA create foreign policy that would affect Europe, which angered many Americans. Like, OMG, they thought, we just helped you out and now you won't listen to us? So this negative public opinion resulted in the U.S. never joining the League of Nations. Our Senate never approved it. So how can we determine that the League of Nations following World War I was a failure? Yeah, well, here you go. World War II happened. There was another war. Duh. Anyway, the costs of World War I were enormous. More than 8.5 million people died. 17 million people were wounded. There was widespread famine, which means people were starving to death, and disease was widespread. Yucky, dirty conditions existed following the war. OMG, someone grab a Swiffer. Yeah, not that easy. There were many war deaths because of factories, farms, and homes having been destroyed. They all needed to be rebuilt. Europe is going to take years to recover from World War I, and really, none of the problems that existed before the war had ever really been resolved. Oh no. And these issues are going to resurface during the 1920s and eventually lead to the rise of communist and fascist regimes, and eventually World War II. But more on that later. And that, my friends, is World War I in a nutshell. Next up, well, what happened after the fighting stopped? Stay tuned.